Good afternoon, everyone. Happy feast day to you. Today is the feast of the Transfiguration of the Lord. So I hope you have all had a good day. It's actually quite providential that today's feast precedes this 19th Sunday of Ordinary Time in Cycle A, because the readings for this coming Sunday speak of the revelation of God, how people encounter or experience God. In fact, in the Missal, that's actually sort of given as the theme for this Sunday, the revelation of God and the revelation of Christ. Well, today's Feast of the Transfiguration reveals God in all his glory, and God points to Jesus. This is my beloved Son, listen to him. And so who Jesus is revealed in today's feast. So there is a nice link between today's feast and our readings for this coming Sunday. So what are they? Well, the first reading is taken from the first book of Kings, chapter 19, verse 9, and then verses 11 to 13. This little extract from the first book of Kings is about the prophet Elijah, who lived about 900 years before Jesus was born. And this little extract is about the prophet and his dealings with King Ahab and his devious wife, Jezebel. We know the story. Jezebel is plotting all sorts of things, and she doesn't like the prophet Elijah, and so she's out to get him, and he runs away. And part of his exile, his time away from the awful Queen Jezebel, is spent at Mount Horeb, the mountain of God, where he encounters God. And so that's the context for that first reading. Elijah is fearful, and he has reason to be fearful. He's not just a wimp. He's scared, and he's got reason to be scared. So he runs away, and in his time away, he has this experience of God in the earthquake, in the small whispering wind. And so the call that the prophet had received is given strength, is sustained and nourished by his encounter with God. God reveals himself in an unexpected way to Elijah. And that encounter, that revelation that Elijah is able to experience, helps him to overcome his fear, helps him to face the mission, the task that God has for him, and to deal with the nasty Queen Jezebel. So that's the first book of Kings, our first reading for this coming Sunday. The psalm is Psalm 85, and the response is, "Let us see, O Lord, your mercy, and grant us your salvation." In other words, we all would like to experience, to encounter the glory of God. And that glory of God comes in all sorts of ways, including by an experience of God's mercy, his compassion, his forgiveness. And so God is revealed in different ways, as the first reading has told us. And so that's the psalm, a nice psalm for a response to that first reading. The second reading is, of course, from the letter of St. Paul to the Romans. We now start chapter 9 verses 1 to 5. It's a good reading, this, because it's clear that St. Paul is concerned about his brethren, his brothers and sisters of the Jewish faith. And he wants to share with them the experience, the encounter he has had with Jesus. And he doesn't want them to miss out on this encounter. I think also there's a sense in what St. Paul is saying here, that he also understands that while he has had this encounter with the Lord, it doesn't in any way make him superior. It doesn't in any way mean that he shouldn't be concerned with those who have not had the encounter, those who do not know Jesus, his brothers and sisters. There is a link there with those people of the Jewish faith, and he feels that he in some way needs to maintain that link and to share Jesus with them. And so in many ways this speaks to us about what our encounters with God are about. They are there to help us share God, to bring others to an encounter. And I think this reading is also powerful because for so many of us, we have family members who maybe used to go to church and don't anymore, or never been to church. So in some ways we can relate to St. Paul's feelings, that he would love his brothers and sisters in the Jewish faith to have an encounter, to experience Jesus. The gospel. What a wonderful gospel this is. The famous story of Jesus walking on the water. And it's a story that we don't only find in Matthew's gospel. We find it in Mark's gospel, chapter 6 of Mark's gospel, and also in St. John's gospel, chapter 16. It's important for us to see that this coming Sunday's gospel follows immediately on from last Sunday's reading. And if you remember, last Sunday I spoke about how that extract of chapter 14 linked to the first 12 verses of chapter 14, that banquet of Herod. Do you remember? And so the banquet of Herod, the feeding of the 5,000, and then Jesus walking on the water should be seen as a whole. We shouldn't forget what happened last Sunday or what preceded that in the 14th chapter of St. Matthew's Gospel. So if you remember, Jesus was upset about his cousin's death, the beheading of John the Baptist, which we heard about in those first 12 verses of chapter 14. And so he had gone off to a lonely place and the crowd had followed him. That's what we read last Sunday. And Jesus doesn't withdraw any further. He meets the needs of those who have come to him. Now he has fed them. He sends his disciples away. And if you remember last Sunday, you can go back and reread it, the disciples had come to Jesus to ask him to send the crowd away to go and find food. And Jesus hadn't. In fact, he fed them with the help of the disciples. Well, now that everybody's been fed, Jesus sends his disciples away so that he can return to a time of prayer and reflection and maybe deal with his sadness at the death of his cousin. And so they go away and Jesus is praying. Something else that really struck me this week about the gospel, this walking on the water. Somehow, I suppose in my head, I had thought that, the storm came up and Jesus dealt with it quite quickly. But my reading and my reflecting, I realized that that's not true. That The gospel story is such that it seems that the disciples had been battling with this wind, rowing into this wind that was against them, and I suppose the waves were quite choppy and difficult for some time. And Jesus only comes to them walking on the water in the fourth watch of the night. Now, the fourth watch of the night would be between sort of 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. So the disciples had left Jesus in the evening, we're told, after the feeding of the 5,000. They had battled this difficult headwind and rough seas for most of the night. And it is only in the early hours of the morning that Jesus comes to them. So you can imagine then the disciples are tired, they're exhausted, and they are fearful because nothing seems to be calming down. The waves are still there and it is still stormy. They're tired and frustrated and anxious, and only now does Jesus appear to them walking on the water. Of course, this gospel is filled with all sorts of images that speak to us and would have spoken to Matthew's church, that early community for which St. Matthew wrote his gospel. The storm, the sea, the waves. For the people of Jesus' time, the sea was a scary place, and the Sea of Galilee could often have very sudden, quick, violent storms. And so the people of Jesus' time were scared of the sea, were scared of storms. They were very fearful. So the idea of fear. The boat, we know, for so long, the boat has been the symbol of the church. It would have been in Matthew's time too. They would have seen the boat as a symbol for the church. And so the church is being tossed around on this difficult sea. And in fact, I discovered that the word that Matthew uses for being tossed around on the sea, on the waves, is actually, we could actually use the word tortured. So the boat is being tortured by the waves. And that really gives us a sense of the church being persecuted, the church under pressure from all the things of the world. Matthew's community would have known that. Don't we know that ourselves too? The pressures on the church that torture us. And then, of course, Jesus walks on the water, and Peter wants to go to Jesus. What's very, very important about that invitation of Jesus, that appearance of Jesus in the midst of this fear and torture, is that Jesus immediately says, do not be afraid. Take courage. Similar things, so he repeats it. And very often in revelations of God, God says, do not be afraid. Take courage. So by saying that, Jesus is revealing God. The second thing to note is that Jesus says, I am. It is me. I am. And that has links to the book of Exodus, where Moses encounters God in the call of Moses to go and liberate his people from slavery, to bring them into the freedom of the promised land. So Matthew has Jesus use the same phrase, I am. And I am stands for God. And the people of Matthew's time would have immediately picked that up and recognized it. That Jesus uses this phrase, I am, therefore I am God. So this is a powerful revelation of God. Take courage, I am. And God walks on the waters, that the fear, the torture, the turmoil of the world is nothing to him. It doesn't affect him. So those are powerful things that come through from these readings, and it's a wonderful gospel for us this coming Sunday. So if we want an overarching theme, revelation, the revelation of God. God is revealed, and we see this quite clearly in all three readings in many ways, but certainly in the first reading and the gospel. But also that this revelation of God conquers our fear. It conquered Elijah's fear. It conquers the fear of the disciples in the boat. And so the question we need to ask ourselves, the encounters we have with God, do they help us to overcome the many fears we deal with and grapple with in our modern world? Okay, so there's some thoughts and ideas for this coming Sunday. I hope they help you. I hope they help you to think and reflect, so that when you join us for Mass on Sunday, you'll hear God challenging you, but also comforting you and strengthening you. Have a great day. We look forward to seeing you on Sunday. God bless. Be safe.